Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Future of Space. I'm your host, Daniel Fox. Our guest today is Daniel Inocente. Daniel is an American architect, space architect, and researcher. He is the founder of Daniel Inocente Architecture, a New York-based firm delivering innovative and sustainable designs across residential, commercial, mixed-use, and aerospace sectors. His experience includes working with Frank Gehry, NASA, Blue Origin, and Skidmore, Owings Merrill. Daniel served as a senior space architect at Blue Origin, where he worked on government and commercial habitation and space systems. He's also a professor of practice in architecture at Arizona State University, where he teaches design studios, including technical courses on building systems, as well as courses for the MSD in space architecture and extreme environment. Daniel, welcome to the Future Space.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So let's start with your three words that for you capture the essence of space.
I think one of them for sure is discovery. There's so much to be discovered. And so for me, that word resonates really well. The other one is humanity. And the third word I have to say is innovation. And I think those three words really capture the essence of space for us as a human species.
Were you always attracted to space?
Yes, absolutely. When I think back to my childhood, I was always very curious about the existence of human beings and where we came from. I found myself asking questions to my parents, to family members, to professors, and nobody ever really had an adequate answer for me. And so, I even looked into religion and dove into philosophy to try to understand this question. So I think it's just innate in human beings. As we're growing up, you start to question things around you and you start to find answers in some of the most uncommon ways. So for me, it was a very early curiosity about what space meant, where we are in the universe, and who we are as a human species.
Looking how harsh and against us space is when it comes to living there, do you think that we have a place living in space?
Absolutely. This is Earth. Where else can we be? We found no other planet like it. I remember, talking to friends who were deep into space exploration and science, looking at things like exoplanets and trying to understand how many celestial bodies exist out there in the universe that could resemble something like Earth. And the answers are always, they may be out there. We don't know, but this is it. This is what we know. And as you've seen pictures coming back from the Artemis mission, we see Earth in space and there's nothing but blackness around us. And so it's really something important to think about and to try to appreciate, what a beautiful place we have to live in.
One of the things that I've always struggled with is on every science fiction movies, when they design the architect of the future, it's very cold. It's very actually boring. It lacks our capacity to enhance the environment around us, as if the future was just devoid of life or nature. When you look at the future here on Earth and also in space, whether through space stations or settlements, what is your vision of that architecture?
Yeah, this is a good point because, usually we depict living in harmony as something akin to paradise. And it has to do with our appreciation of, what is nature, what is life. And so I think there's countless depictions of what it would mean to live in something that is beautiful and is harmonious with the ways that we live. But then when you're going to space, there's really none of that. You don't have nature. Nature's the most, and nature in the terms of, life. And so there's this aspect of life, which is just self-evolving, self-creating. And that's where you see species of plants and animals and different ways of interactions. It's hard for us as humans to transpose that kind of environment, which has taken millions of years to evolve. But what we can do is we can bring some of those things that make us human with us if we're trying to imagine a future where humans are out there in space or on other celestial bodies, but we have to do it through technology. And so the best way to do that is to replicate those ideas of environment through technology and maybe bring some of that with us. So for example, without life, you can't really have wood. And that material alone here on Earth, it's abundant, but in space, you're not going to see it. And so it may become one of those materials that's the most valuable materials to bring with us, if not other aspects of, what we experience on Earth. And so there's so many things to discuss around this, but, I'll leave it there.
The incentives on Earth are often against doing the right thing. Like you said, it's so abundant. It's actually cheaper to just go and cut another tree or throw out the garbage. But when you are in space, that atom of transformed carbon that you have on board the ship, it's like gold. You can't just throw it out. You have to figure out how to reuse it over and over and over again. So we're going to have to develop these systems that are very efficient in terms of being self-sustained, as opposed to throwing out the trash and thinking that you can go to a different planet and fuel up on resources, right?
Absolutely. And that's where technology gets involved, because, we're trying to harness the amazing resources that are out there. The universe has abundance of resources, different kinds of resources that can fuel economies in space. But then harnessing those resources requires a very sophisticated technology at scale. And if you're going to do that for the production of things like fuel and power and oxygen or water, those systems we have to develop on Earth and then carry them with us and make sure that they work. And if anything goes wrong, that we have backup systems in place. And there's a lot of complexity in that. As an architect, usually the way that we work is we help define the world of possibilities for architecture. And then we identify what systems, what technologies can be a part of that vision to help create that livable environment. And so we tend to work with a lot of subject matter experts to help us identify what those key technologies are and where we can perhaps push the envelope into creating much better capabilities.
One of the things that people often forget or take for granted is our relationship from nature with nature has been interesting. Back in the days, nature was very much something that we constantly had to fight. It was, whether it was farming or whether it was if you had your house or your little hut, the environment of nature around you were constantly in aggression to your safety, to your livelihood. And then buildings became a little bit more of a fortress, and where it was more about controlling the elements, controlling all the different variables that you can, so you can be as safe or as predictable as possible. I always have these very funny memories of reading about the people who try to design Stanley Park in Vancouver or Central Park in New York, and having this very, very pristine idea of what a park could be, which should be, and then they start planting the trees, they start to design, and then they realize that all hell breaks loose. Nothing is what they want it to be. They realize that you can't just let nature do whatever it wants to do, because it will just transform everything in something else. Today is very much a new place where we are at, and where we have the technology that allows us to now to incorporate nature back into our designs. Because from an architectural point of view, nature is very challenging, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I like this topic that you brought up about nature being out of our control, because that's what I would call wilderness. And, if you look back throughout history, there's mythological beings and creatures that were created because of humans' fear of nature in that sense. And so the way that we control nature is by designing it, by creating parks and open spaces and creating the boundaries from where you have wilderness and where you have civilization. And as we think about bringing nature closer to the city, we do it in a very controlled way. So even within New York, you have parcels that are dedicated to parks and trees and green space. Or even within architecture itself, you can imagine nature being a part of the building and the infrastructure. But that's a very controlled way of looking at nature. It's not nature in its real sense, because if you go beyond Earth, nature wants to kill you. Nature is extreme. You can't do anything out there as a human being. You need to be surrounded by technology in order for you to even survive in that kind of nature. And I think, there's many ways to look at nature, but the kind of nature that we want to bring with us is the kind that helps us become healthier and that helps us feel better. And really, it's that connection that we have to nature because we evolved on Earth.
Because you don't want the roots starting to figure out their way through your spaceship and be out of control. I mean, we always have these visions of buildings of the future, and they have grass and trees all over the building. But the reality is First of all, this is very heavy. The accumulation of water, and then these are very dynamic ecosystem because they attract insects and birds, and it starts to accumulate. I mean, you look in the jungle, these big canopies where it's such a dynamic environment, extremely hard to control. So either in buildings or in the spaceship or in the settlement, nature has to be more controlled and left to its own device.
That's very true. And I think you're alluding to some of those visions from Gerard O'Neill, like these massive colonies in space that are living, and it looks almost like you've transposed what you see in the suburbs into space. And that's not the reality of it. I think, that's a really interesting ambition, but the reality of it is that it's going to be far more technological and perhaps far more contained. For any purpose of human missions to space, you need to focus first on being able to maintain survival. And then nature becomes something that could be, maybe a luxury. And if it is there, it's going to be to some limited degree. So I don't think we'll see those Gerard O'Neill type colonies and civilizations happening within our lifetime, but it's a really amazing point of inspiration for us to think about. And this has been happening for decades. People have been envisioning these kinds of civilizations for a long time.
I have a feeling that you've dabbled a lot in that question for quite some time, and, can go down the rabbit hole of religion and mythology, but we've almost kind of evolved separated from our environment. We saw the extension of buildings or even tools just more as these separated elements. You can even see that into architecture, where buildings became more a representation of objects, not necessarily connected to the human story, but more as a vision of something else. Over the few decades, the understanding of architecture have started to incorporate more the human story, the human element of it. So where are we at right now into developing these environments that are very much more part of our experience, where we're not trying to impose something, we're trying to understand who we are and how can we elevate our lives through the buildings?
I think in the context of space, you're absolutely right to depict it this way. But architecture, traces its roots thousands of years back. And so if you look at the history of architecture, humanity has always been a part of it in some way, shape, or form. Different cultures, different parts of the world have looked at architecture and have essentially embodied themselves into architecture. And you see that happening in religious forms of architecture, in civil types of architecture, even in emergent architecture around the world. But, what happens is that as we develop more constraints for architecture, as architecture becomes more modernized, and there's things like regulation and density and transportation, and, we're starting to develop cities as a system of systems. And space architecture, in some ways, is an extension of that, because we're just adding layers of constraints. And in this sense, we have environmental constraints, technological constraints. There's so many other kinds of constraints, but it doesn't mean that we can't bring civilization and humanity with us. And so the challenge for an architect like myself, when working on these kinds of problems, is to think, well, what can we do with the tools and capabilities available in a way that allows humans to thrive? And sometimes those kinds of successes can be very minimal. For example, like on the ISS, there's a few demonstrations of how architecture, in the design sense, has played a role in helping create a much more livable environment. And then as we're thinking about building these commercial stations and off-world destinations, I think, architects play a very critical role in that, to some limited degree. But that's why architects have to be much more intimate with the engineering and the systems of systems that are involved in that, because it's only then that we can actually start to really have a conversation with all of the different objectives that drive space architecture, which is a field of its own, still an evolving field, but it is something that you can take your skills in architecture as a trained architect and still apply the same kind of thinking, problem solving, making connections between different disciplines, and then working together to try and create something that's more meaningful and more efficient and more cost effective, etc. So there's, I think, a lot of possibility for bringing that human factor to space architecture, because we do it on Earth. And that's what we do as architects. We bring meaning to societies, to civilizations, to cities And we can do the same thing in space. We just have to do it carefully.
Because obviously right now what we're doing in space is more like wilderness camping, very rudimentary and rough, and it's sleeping bags. But the idea of living in that environment is not very enticing. We're going to have to bring the human experience to space. And when you're looking at bringing that human experience, I guess the two big elements that present the biggest challenge is gravity and radiation. I guess also the available resources. So what are the big restraints that you work with when you're designing working on space stations?
And this is a great question because it depends on the context in which you're working on this. So for instance, if you're working on a real mission, if you're working with a big aerospace company, with NASA, with government, and you're trying to develop a real mission scenario for sending humans to space, the problem space becomes much more constrained because you have to understand the different mission variables, the objectives, the time constraints, and then you start getting into things like the environment. Where are we going to be placing this habitat? Is it in low Earth orbit? Is it on the lunar surface? What are the conditions? And obviously, if you're thinking about putting a habitat on the lunar surface, there's a lot of things that are going to be unknown unless we do some prospecting. And so other components have to play a role in that ecosystem. And we have to gather some more information to try to understand where we're going to place the habitat. And as you start to understand the environment, just like on Earth, when you're designing a building, you want to understand what's the geology of the area. What are the constraints in terms of sun exposure? Can you harness some of that energy? What are the durations of shadow versus light? Because those things impact the materials and also the exposure to the sky, because as you know, we have radiation in space. And so for the most part, anything below you, you're protected because you're on the lunar surface. And so the mass of the moon is going to protect you underneath, but then radiation is still coming at you from above. And so you want to put materials between you and that radiation. And typically, that's measured in terms of exposure duration for any human being based on the likelihood of developing some kind of cancer-related illness. And the thing that really helps us with that is materials. So the more materials you put between you and that external environment, the more likely you are to protect yourself. And these are questions that you start to think about as you're designing a space habitat, because on top of those variables, you have to think about what are the activities that the humans are going to be doing. They're not just going up there for camping and for tourism. They're most likely going to be going up there to do some kind of experiments and work and science. They have to be able to communicate with people back on Earth. And so there's all these components that really play a critical role in that. And it's not just equipment and furniture. It's the integration of all these systems that really helps bring to bear the skills of an architect. And those are the kinds of challenges that I really enjoy working on, and things that I've worked on in the past. And so the question of what are the constraints? There's so many to think about.
When you watch science fiction movies or TV series like Foundation or Star Wars, and you see these buildings, Foundation had the giant elevator that goes up. Star Wars has the Death Star. Do you look at it with the architect mind and eye, try to figure out, well, I believe there was actually a study that was made on the economics of a building like this, the resources, the buildings, all the people that it would demand to hire. And you look at Foundation, the elevator, this humongous structure and the ring around. It's one thing to dream about those, but the building of these structures is something absolutely different, correct?
Oh, yes, absolutely. That's a different type of civilization you're talking about. To be able to accomplish those kinds of feats of engineering requires a different evolution. So, I think it's really inspiring to see those kinds of science fiction movies. And obviously, everyone who watches them is inspired. I heard recently that Dune 3 was sold out already, and I really wanted to go see the IMAX version of it. But it's those kinds of, visionary ideas that sometimes there's like a blurry edge between reality and what's science fiction. And you see that happening all the time. And I love to identify those kinds of things because you realize that, the only real limitation is what humans, I guess, don't want to go out and conquer and do. The imagination is a powerful tool. So through the imagination, you can come up with realities that can be brought into being if we work hard enough at it. Obviously, there are certain things that you can't do, like break the laws of physics. But aside from that, you can do so much. And it's just incredible to see what the human species is capable of doing, even looking back in history.
Daniel, the field of architecture has developed so much in terms of material, technology. Now you have tools, virtual reality, in where you can test, you can experiment, you can design before even going into building. How different the field of architecture is from where you started to where you think is going?
Oh, this is a critical question. Actually, I'm working on a book regarding this. And I've always had a fascination with the way that we create buildings and designs. And it's similar to, if you think about arts and crafts and sculpture, the tool sets really help define what you create. And when it comes to architecture, if you go back far enough, there was a time when people were drawing on paper. And then those drawings had to be superimposed on top of other drawings that then would do some coordination. Then you would have to run it through a machine to create replicas. And so all the technologies that were used back then are no longer really being used. I mean, you can still put a pencil to paper, but that's usually done for freehand sketching. Now everything is digital. Everything is either in the form of CAD, computer-aided software, or parametric software. And what you see happening right now at this instance is that there's agentic AI systems that are starting to transform how we use these tools. Right now, they're just being used as enhancers. And so you could, for example, go into Claude, type in a prompt, and directly in your CAD software, you'll see some geometry that is generated based on the description. This is a really powerful paradigm shift because it starts to create a path for us to essentially describe the way that we create objects, buildings, products. And on top of that, there's agentic AI systems that are doing engineering for you. So you can run through Claude or something similar, and you can do simulations, you could do calculations. If you wanted to look at the stresses and loads of a structure of a given size, it will give you the size of the components and the kind of material that you should use. And then imagine being able to put this then into a CAD environment and then sending that CAD model over to a fabricator. And without ever touching a mouse, that would be incredible. And I see that happening not just in architecture, but also in the way that we build other things that we use, like automobiles and airplanes. And so the question is, what can't you do with technology nowadays? And this is going to change the way that we create very rapidly. So for me, at least, the question of what it means to become an architect, the agency behind it, the authorship behind it, all of that is being changed. And we have to, I think, retrain ourselves in the way that we typically think about building design, because usually you're trained as an architect to understand things like regulations, codes, processes. CAD is only a tool. Drawing is only a tool to be able to get information from your head to a piece of paper to a contractor and then follow the rules and codes. So the future is changing very rapidly.
The capacity to manage information is something that is very different from the past, and not just in architecture, but also in exploration or gathering data from faraway worlds. Back in the days of exploration, if you want to know the weather in Antarctica during the winter, you had to physically go over there, almost die in the process. And it was a very miserable adventure. Now, you just put a little instrument that's going to collect the data. Currently, we have robots on Mars that are collecting data. So by the time we do show up, we will never be blind as the first time that we went to the moon. So the human cost of exploration will never be what it used to be. In the same way that, like in architecture or even in science or technology, if you wanted to try something, you had to physically do it, experiment, burn yourself in the process or die in the process. But now with AI and all these tools, you can recreate, you can simulate, you can study, and you can enhance all the options. And I'm pretty sure that from your point of view, the possibilities, the canvas on which you're playing now is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think this is really interesting because, like you were saying, typically you would have to test something, which I think that's still, a question mark. You still want to be able to build something. And so you never learn as much about a product or a system or a building than you do when you're actually building it, in situ. And so that's still a very good learning process because there's so many other variables involved, like who's going to make it, what's the material quality, what are the imperfections. There's so many things that are still unknown. I mean, just to be able to get from an idea down to an engineered design, or at least something that's good enough to start being made, that's a really amazing capability. And I think it's going to really increase the speed at which we see products being developed, buildings being developed. I'm actually very excited for this. There's also the question of, regulation, which, as you know, constrains a lot of the things that we do in architecture, but also in aerospace. I think there's going to be a time in which we design something, a system, we process it through some kind of regulatory AI system, and then it takes a look at all the constraints and it comes back to you with a report saying, if you change X, Y, and Z, you're a go. You can build it. I think we're going to start seeing that. So there's a lot of new things that are going to start transforming the way that we create the built environment around us, and also future systems that will take us to space and elsewhere.
How challenged are we from understanding or dealing with the reality that your buildings have to move? Skyscrapers, like if you really look at it, they're moving, they have a damper that moves with them. When I learned that a submarine actually will move about a meter from the surface to at the bottom because of the pressure. When you go to space, you have the sun who's going to make it super hot, and then like the James Webb telescope, where on one side is very hot and then on the other side it's minus I don't know how many Kelvin. Do we have a very clear grasp on how these materials are moving?
Yeah, the way I think about this is usually a large scale system, whether it's a building or a spacecraft, it's made of a lot of different materials. And so you always think of them as, an assembly of materials and components. So you have to understand what are the material properties, the expansion, contraction ratios, depending on the temperature or exposure to wind or any other force. So as you're designing something, you have to take into account that movement. For example, if a material expands at a greater rate than another material, then you just have to make sure that there's certain tolerances built into it. And that happens at every scale. As you know, like at any scale, there's that kind of dynamic. And it's just the way that materials interact with the environment around them. When you're talking about a really tall building, you have to take into account the wind loads, and at different elevations, the wind loads change. Concrete has a different behavior than steel, has a different behavior than glass, has a different behavior than composites. And so all these things, they take a lot of careful engineering. But I think going back to the point of using AI, it's that engineering can actually be accelerated much faster if we understand the behavior of materials, which we have a pretty good understanding of all kinds of materials that we invent, alloys and different composites. So if we put that into an equation and you say, here's my design in the form of a CAD model, and then you assign different material properties, you can simulate it pretty well. It's not perfect, but it's enough to where, you need to also build a safety factor, and that safety factor helps you cross the finish line.
One thing people take so much for granted, they don't understand how incredible it is just their cars, their vehicle. You can literally drive a car from plus 40 Fahrenheit, and then you can go into a winter storm and it will still be driving the way it's supposed to be driving, and the doors will close the way it's supposed to be closing. But in terms of material, even houses are not like that. Houses will move, they will expand. Most of the things that we build are built specifically for that type of environment. But if you start moving them into different places, they will behave differently. The other day I'm flying over New York and I'm looking out the window and I'm imagining the Italian explorer arriving on the island of New York and with all the trees. And if I would go back and I would tell them I'm flying over this land in a vehicle and where I can eat, I can sleep, I can go to the bathroom, and where you see trees, there's going to be skyscrapers where people exist and there's going to be light. They would not even understand this vision. In fact, I would be thrown to the fire as a witch. When you look at the future, or when you try to imagine possibilities of what it can be, how do you see the future being built?
One of the ways I think about it is first how we build cities. You see that around the world, cities are growing at an incredible rate. So whether it's an existing city increasing in density, and what happens is cities then have to respond to that density. And usually you have to respond with infrastructure, for being able to move people from one place to another with additional housing, commercial spaces, buildings. And then you have other parts of the world where they're trying to build cities out of thin air. And obviously not out of thin air, but, from where there was nothing there before. And you see that the timeline from where a city begins as something a little more primitive, like a port city, or maybe like a tourist destination, to where it becomes a fully thriving metropolis, that timeline is compressing because we have, mobilized so many parts of the ecosystem of what it takes to build a city: materials, transportation, components. And I think what I see is cities are going vertical. No matter what, that's the only way to really densify a city, especially if you want to live in a city like New York. And then the other thing is that there's a lot of adaptive reuse, where you take an existing piece of infrastructure, like, for example, the High Line, and then you improve it in such a way where the density around it increases tenfold. Those kinds of circumstances are happening around the world. You see that happening. There's also this question of what is a city in relationship to the building, because you see some of these mega projects, whether it's a big corporate headquarters or a big housing development, basically become almost like an ecosystem of their own. And there's a lot of precedent for this. You see that happening in Saudi Arabia. You see that happening in the UAE, in Asia, here in the US as well. But buildings are becoming, in some ways, their own ecosystem, where sometimes you don't even have to leave the building or leave the neighborhood block. You have everything you need. And transportation is going to be essential to this, because imagine if we can get rid of all the surface cars, or maybe have some kind of subterranean system that connects people from building to building. And then maybe there's other ways of transport that are much more efficient and maybe smaller in scale. I think that's the question that, as architects have a very important role in playing, because we're designing the future and we have to take into consideration some of these new shifts. And I've been a part of projects like that where we've been asked by a client, can you reimagine this portion of a city, of an existing city, into something that can possibly house 10 million people by 2030? And that's a huge jump in population, but it's what people are thinking about. It's what stakeholders are thinking about, because we have to start increasing the ability to absorb the increase in population and the shifts in population. There's a lot of, I think, challenges associated with this, but there's also a lot of opportunity, especially in the form of design and urban planning, as well as architecture.
There are always unintended consequences for every solution that you think is going to solve something. It creates another situation. I think it was in Brazil. They were looking to curb down the use of cars. So they made it illegal. Basically, if you had a car that had a certain letter into your license plate, you could drive on certain days and not on other days. And instead of curbing traffic, it actually increased it, because people went out and bought a second car. And that second car was not as efficient. It was kind of just a cheap car, less efficient. So now you had more less efficient cars on the road. You had more traffic. And all that started with the idea of curbing the traffic. The scaling of population or human behavior is not always as control, again, like nature, or predictable, or it will not go according to the way that you want it. And those are the challenges that you're always dealing with.
That's a great point. Yeah, there's always loopholes. And that's where you see, there's a reaction to the way that the city is being built and the way that regulations are being created. And so when those loopholes appear, and if they become a nuisance or something that doesn't really benefit people, then of course you have to figure out a way to close that loophole. But then there's also, I think, indirect positive outcomes sometimes that are unintended from creating urbanism that is conducive to human well-being. And those things can come in the form of things like incentives. If you incentivize density because you add, for example, more affordable housing or more green space or access to certain amenities, those kinds of things are really conducive to human welfare, human well-being. And I think, as architects, we have to take advantage of those incentives and try to steer designs in that direction. Even something like a single family home could be designed in such a way where there's unintended consequences that are beneficial. So if, for example, a client says, I love natural light, and you come in and you say, I'm going to design the most, abundant natural light house you've ever seen. And because of that, you have to specify high performance windows or high performance glazing. And then you realize, you know what? Actually, we're getting a lot of amazing benefits from this light, as well as being able to create an architecture that connects you with nature. Those kinds of, indirect sometimes opportunities, they present themselves. And then all of a sudden, the client starts to help you identify more of these kinds of things. And that's where I think, architecture should lead the way. Architecture should try to always steer in the direction of how do I improve the health and the welfare of humans and the connection they have to human experience.
And understanding the difference between what we like and what we can live in. When I was in marketing, I always remember the design of a campaign that is supposed to grab your attention is very much different than something in where you have to interact every single day. Something in where you want to go and visit, hypothetically for interior design or even architecture, you want a building that's going to wow you or is going to be very in your face. But if you were to come every single day and this is going to be your house, that same design is going to be almost kind of working against you. You're going to learn to hate it. The design has to be more subtle. So understanding what the client is asking and also what is best for their own lifestyle, that's part of the education that you have to do, right?
Oh, yeah. That's a great point. So a lot of architects, I think they would basically force you to live in their vision. And that's not what I would consider myself. I would always think of myself as someone who works with a client or stakeholders and try to understand what they want and try to listen. And it's only through that act of listening and being patient that you can really start to deliver something that is unique to them, that speaks of who they are and sometimes gives them an outcome that they maybe did not anticipate, but that they love. And so those kinds of things are very important in the process. You have to listen. But at any scale, there has to be some kind of stepping back and listening to the client, listening to the stakeholders, listening to the community, listening to the people that you're working with, and then trying to absorb that and channel that energy and that information into a design that speaks to everyone. And that's not an easy challenge. That's very difficult.
How was it to work with Frank Gehry? His buildings were very much a part of his vision. Was he aware of the challenge of connecting the vision with the purpose of the building and making sure these two marry each other? Or there was always some tension over there trying to create?
Yeah. By the way, when I started working there, this for me was like a dream come true. I never thought that I would end up working at Frank Gehry's office. I remember the first day I arrived after the interview, I walked in and I saw so many beautiful models. The process of his architecture was unlike any other that I had ever seen before. Models of different scales, of different materials, just pure creativeness. And seeing that process and then being a part of that process for me was very insightful because it's another world of architecture. It's a different way to deliver architecture and a different way to think about architecture. And if you look into his work and his background, he never pretended to be anything more than an architect and artist who wanted to inspire people and who wanted to bring humanity back to architecture. Some people love it, some people don't like it as much, but all of the work that he did, it to me was like a masterpiece. Just the amount of rigor and the technology that had to be applied to be able to create those sculptural forms was incredible. And so when I got to work there, I remember, just the scale of the projects like the Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi and the teams that were working on them, different teams working on different parts of the building. The buildings were so complex that you would have entire teams just working on one part of the building. Frank Gehry would, of course, come in and provide his feedback, his input, his creative thinking behind the project. And he was a real leader in that sense. He was someone who really pushed the envelope. And I'm very grateful that I was able to work there and to be surrounded by him and the team and to be able to work even on his personal house. That was an incredible experience. But to answer your question, I think he was very much like a formalist in that sense. It was about, again, connecting humans to experience. And you can do that through form because light interacts with form in different ways where you can really start to get the sense of, what is it to be in space? And that's what architecture can do for you. They can create a sense of space, and you can do that through materials, through different geometries. His work always did that in many ways.
And I know that even in design or architecture, when I worked as a producer for web designs, There's the designers who create the experience, and then you have the developers behind. They have to execute, or they have to try to figure out how to execute that vision. And I know that in architecture, you have the vision of the building, and then you have the engineers behind that are trying to figure it out how to make it happen, whether it's building in Miami with all these different forms and they all have to match. And it's always a very dynamic relationship between the vision and the engineering. Daniel, what are the 5 buildings that excite you right now when you know that they're being built or they're being designed?
Oh, that's a good question. There's so many interesting projects out there. So I've had experience working on projects at scale. When I was working at SOM, I got to work on some high-rise buildings, very tall buildings. One of those projects was the Guyang World Trade Center, which was a really interesting project. I've seen how that project is coming, and it looks really incredible. The other project I would love to go see is the Burj Khalifa, because it still stands as the tallest building in the world, and I can only imagine what it's like to be at the top. And then there's a building that's been under construction for a while, but will surpass the height of the Burj Khalifa, called the Jeddah Tower. And so when that gets completed, I'd love to go see that. And then there's some projects that I also worked on, like the Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi, which is still under construction, but has made significant progress. And I've seen pictures of that looks just incredible. The timber structure, if you look it up, you'll see the assemblage of the timber structure being erected and the beautiful galleries. Just amazing to see what they're building right on the shore. They basically had to build the land up because it's sitting on the water. And then adjacent to that project is another project that I've always wanted to go see, which is the Jean Nouvel Louvre in Abu Dhabi. It has this incredible canopy with the most sophisticated pattern, and he's known for doing this. But the beauty of that project always impressed me. So I can't wait to go see that. And, actually one project, okay, this is close to home, but the project that I want to see, which we're going to go see together, is the Chase Tower by Norman Foster. So I can't wait to go see that building. There's so many more projects, but those projects I would highlight.
Did you ever see the Museum of the Future in Dubai?
I haven't seen it in person, but I know which one you're talking about, and it looks very cool.
Do you think we'll ever be able to break the 1 kilometer barrier when it comes to skyscrapers?
Yes, I know, because I've worked on ideas for that. So it's going to happen at some point. Just wait. Humanity has no limitation when it comes to the audacity to create bigger and taller structures. You will see that happening, hopefully, in our lifetimes. But the engineering is complex, and it changes the type of structure in a unique way, but it's not impossible. And so it's something that I think will happen at some point. Just like some of those mega projects that you see in NEOM. You have these like kilometer long buildings, and I know that those have seen some challenges, but the ambition behind it is still amazing.
Briefly on that design, do you think it's realistic, that whole design of the Line desert?
Well, it's not really about, for me at least, it's not about being realistic. It's really about the ambition to create something of this scale, to create essentially what is like a micro city within a single envelope. And so that has so much potential as a model for civilization. But in terms of the scale is really ambitious. And I think the scale has to possibly, be rethought, but it doesn't mean that it can't be done over time. I personally like those kinds of projects because it pushes us to do things that are bigger, greater, and more inspiring. I mean, if that's a project that is less challenging than building a base on the moon, if you think about it. So come on, if thinking about building a base on the moon and we're talking about it, these types of projects that you see happening on Earth, they're not as challenging.
Daniel, quickly, what would be 3 words of wisdom?
I would say always stay positive. So for anybody who wants to get involved in something great, you always have to motivate yourself and be positive and just be, proactive. Those are many more words, but you get the point. The other one is be creative. Creativity is such an essential part of being in any field. And I think creativity often gets undermined because people think of it as our thing that you put on top, but creativity is essential for solving problems. And then the last one I would say is be resourceful, because no matter how big of an idea you have and how far it might seem, if you start with something small, you can get there. You just have to be persistent and resourceful and do the best you can.
I have One final question, and without any restraint. You're given the choice of building on the moon, building on Mars, building a space station, or building an asteroid. Which one would you go first?
I would go for building on the moon because that's the nearest celestial body that we have. And it's clear that there's abundant resources there that could make it self-sustaining. I think the moon is a great target, and it seems to be where everyone is going. And right now is the right time to be interested in that, talking about that, trying to see how you can play a role. And we're in a perfect point in time where technology is capable of taking the architecture at scale to the next celestial body, in our solar system, which is the moon. And so the moon is a really interesting target.
I was talking yesterday to someone about the moon, and I have this very unique vision that is not always shared by a lot of people. But I'm looking forward to the day where we can look up to the moon and we can see light on the moon, because it will be, right now we have a space station and we can have a lot of space stations, but unless you know exactly what you're looking at, there's no understanding, there's no sense, there's no visual to it. But the day that we can look up and we can see our presence on some other celestial, you can understand how far we've come. So I'm looking for that day. I know that a lot of people, they want to see the moon stay the same, but I'm very much looking forward to see how far. Then that next 50, 60, 70 years, I think it's going to be radically redefine what we understand of the human experience. But
absolutely.
Daniel, it's been a pleasure. We're going to be seeing each other soon in New York City. We've created a program called Designing the Vertical Frontier, because the way that we design programs is always to discover the behind the scene, creating that aha or wow moment, and where people see different in their environment, because it's so easy to take it for granted. So I'm really looking forward to spend that day with you.
Thank you. Likewise, looking forward to it.
Excellent. Have a good day.
You too. See you soon.